Hi, I'm Caitlin Prest, and I am here in your ear to tell you about a very incredible new show called Asking for It. Asking for It is a darkly comedic series that follows a queer femme singer whose history of violence finds her no matter how many times she runs away. It has an original soundtrack, and it'll make you laugh, cry, and feel a little bit less alone. Asking for It. Subscribe now.
This is a CBC podcast.
I'm Eleanor Wachtel, and this is Writers and Company. Today, the artist and author Leanne Shapton. From her prize-winning memoir about training as a swimmer for the Olympics, to her evocative work, guest book, Ghost Stories. Leanne Shapton creates stories using words and pictures. As she says, images carry emotion. Her technical training is as a graphic designer and art director. In fact, she was the art director of the New York Times op-ed page, as well as Saturday Night Magazine and the National Post. In her own graphic novels and conceptual books, she also paints and draws, combining found material such as photographs or even architectural plans with her watercolors and written text. Not surprisingly, perhaps, she's been described as a polymath. Shapton has not only designed book covers for work by Alice Munro, Virginia Woolf, and Jane Austen, but she was also one of the judges for the Man Booker Prize. Leanne Shapton was born in Toronto in 1973 and grew up in the suburb of Mississauga. When she was young, she was a dedicated swimmer, defining herself, she says, privately and abstractly, by my brief, intense years as an athlete. Practiced 5 or 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, weekends spent either training or competing. She twice made it to the Canadian Olympic trials in 1988 and 1992, and she was once ranked 8th nationally. When she was 15, her family moved to the country, so she gave up competitive swimming for a time. After graduating high school, she took it up again in Toronto, and briefly when she studied at McGill University, before going to New York's Pratt Institute of Art and Design. Shapton wrote about her experience in a remarkable, widely praised memoir called Swimming Studies. It won the U.S. National Book Critics Circle Award. As David Rakoff wrote, Leanne Shapton is one of the most broadly creative and gifted people at work today. A true artist, both visual and verbal. There seems to be nothing she cannot write or paint about, with a precision both surgical and poetic. Swimming Studies was Shapton's 4th book. She'd already produced a mix of drawing and text about jealousy called What's She Pretty? And a refiguring of a government reference book, The Native Trees of Canada, where she distilled the images into bold, almost abstract paintings of leaves. But her most startling book was her novel as auction catalog, titled Important Artifacts and Personal Property from the collection of Lenore Doolin and Harold Morris. It chronicled the rise and fall of a 4-year relationship through photos of personal goods for sale alongside the cool auction house descriptions. Shapton was hailed for her inventiveness. Film rights were optioned by Brad Pitt and Natalie Portman. Leanne Shapton's latest work is something different again. Guest book, Ghost Stories, is made up of 33 stories or vignettes, found photographs and illustrations, paintings and invented scenes, revolving around the power of objects and ghosts. Leanne Shapton lives in New York, where she spoke to me from the CBC studio there in the fall of 2019.
You navigate the world, you said, by your love of things. What kinds of things?
Objects, photographs, the shapes of things. My father was an industrial designer, and he taught industrial design, and so I think the value of design and things was instilled pretty early. He collected Studebakers. There was my mom's.
Wait a second. Philippines. Real Studebakers?
Yeah, real Studebakers. Full size. Well, he had real Studebakers, like a 57 Avanti, a Raymond Loewy Avanti, and a Gran Turismo Hawk, and a Champion. And then he had, those Timex rotating display cases for watches that, I don't know, I guess were in department stores. He got one of those, but then all the watches were gone, and he lined up these dinky cars in the case, the display case, and when you plugged it in, it would light up and rotate. So this was our living room. And so, I had an interesting decor around me as a child.
But that increased your appreciation of things, or did you feel like this is
think
totally
so,
weird?
Because, well, I didn't think it was totally weird because it was my childhood. But I think what it did was it gave me a certain design literacy pretty early, like to go, oh, chrome. And now I understand sort of what chrome in cars was, or, oh, that somebody actually designs a snow brush, Everything in Canadian Tire is industrial design. You know what I mean? So it's not just at a level of rarefied kind of rich people kind of furniture or anything, but that everything is designed. And that just meant to me, I think, that everything did have a history and a story. And so when I look at things, I see layers. And I've always kind of done that with things and, become attached to blankets or, a quilt my grandmother made, the grandmother that I didn't ever meet because she died before I was born. So I've always been interested in the stories behind things. This was old stuff. These are old cars. And my mom would bring baskets and things made in the Philippines. And so there were stories behind that.
Because she's from the Philippines.
Yeah. And so having, a mix of dinky cars and then teak bowls from the Philippines, like everything had sort of story and meaning, and I liked hearing those stories from my parents, and then seeing stuff that and they're spectrum hoarders, so it's just
they are spectrum hoarders.
Well, yeah, and now there's a barn. I would say I definitely have the impulse to keep and say, oh, I'll use this later. Oh, I can use this in a, craft project with my daughter. And then you just find yourself walking through paths of strange boxes.
Do things tend to maintain their value for you?
No, not really. I just moved apartments to a smaller apartment, and I got rid of a lot of stuff. And I haven't read the Marie Kondo book, but it was pretty interesting, just sort of, and happy getting a little lighter.
The Marie Kondo in terms of, does this give me joy?
Exactly. Everything gives me joy. Or everything gives me sadness. Why would I get rid of it when it has such pathos? It doesn't matter if it gives me joy or not. I still want to hang on to it. And there's so much, too. I'm a magpie that way that I'll say, oh, I remember this thing I cut out of this magazine, like this in-flight magazine from, Stockholm to whatever, and I'll cut it out because it will matter to a project I have in my head for the future. So I'm always kind of collecting and planning other books or other stories or other projects, so that accumulates, and I'm not that great at organizing that into file folders, so it's stuck to the wall with a piece of Scotch tape
But that's sort of like the writer's notebook. You're collecting images or things like that. In your memoir, Swimming Studies, you mention your collection of old white trousers, hardcover books, striped towels, bathing suits, and fake oranges. Now, I get the books, maybe the clothing, certainly the striped towels, but fake oranges?
Fake oranges. I have a crocheted fake orange. I have a stone fake orange. I have a plastic fake orange. Fake food is so interesting to me. I love fake cakes. And I did this one sculpture of fake butter. There's just something that, I don't know, I find it poignant. It's so perishable. It's like a little still life in itself. It's usually used as a toy. And it makes me remember the Adam Phillips quote that our excesses are clues to our own poverties.
Yes,
so,
I was about, this is a psychotherapist, Adam Phillips, says our excesses are the best clues we have to our own poverty and our best way of concealing it from ourselves. How does that resonate for you?
Well, I think I collect to remind myself of home. I've always been a little bit sort of making my home wherever I go. I've never owned a house. I've always rented, and I'm always sort of making a spaces in studios, and I find my desk to be my home. And again, just having moved and going through a divorce and moving from Canada to the States, I still feel deeply Canadian. I never gave up my citizenship, even though I'd love to vote down here, but I don't feel I'm home here. It doesn't feel like home, and it never really has, and it's made my relationship to Canada actually stronger, I think. So, yeah, I think all those oranges are just, I miss Canada.
Yes, right, land of oranges. Outside of your own collecting, you're interested, you've said, in the patterns people's lives make through their possessions, these magnetic pulls. So investigating other people's collections, does that make you a kind of amateur anthropologist? I mean, what do you look out for?
Well, I think, it's sort of happening socially that people are sending pictures of, or posting pictures of shelfies, say, on Instagram. People are making...
Shelfies are?
Shelfies are pictures of their shelves. Instead of selfies, they take shelfies. And so it's a curated little snapshot of one, it's sort of a portrait of a person through what they're looking at on their shelves. And it can be, you can name drop, you can, based on the spines of the books you're reading, or you can show a flower, or, and I like reading photographs. This is a big part of my practice, is reading photographs. And so looking at other people's possessions and what other people collect is, to me, a far more interesting portrait than, the Bay Portrait Studio or a family picture or a posed picture at a formal event. You don't get any of that through a face. That's, again, why I like posture. I like when people are caught mid-movement or something like that. I like to read people indirectly, I guess. And so through possessions, I remember one time someone was house-sitting, a friend of mine in London, and she threw a dinner party in the stranger's house, and I just said, okay, the couple lives here. Let me go room by room and tell you the state of their marriage, and let's see how far off I am. And by the size of the shoe, how tall a person is, by the kind of little thing. It was so fun.
And were you on the mark? Or?
I was on the mark, yeah. I was sort of like, she wants kids. He's not sure. There's too much fancy, expensive decor here. She definitely has a subscription to World of Interiors. Well, that was evident. But there's samples of it was interesting. And my friend Lottie was like, yeah, pretty close. I hope I didn't reveal.
No, but it's just no one's going to let you into their house now.
I know. Everyone's naked through their possessions. But then it's funny because nobody cares about possessions the same way, so maybe I read too much into it. But I do like, that Sherlock Holmes sort of walk into an empty room and here's what you read. I love visual reading.
Leanne Shapton, you've written about objects recovered from the ill-fated Arctic expedition of Captain Sir John Franklin, the British explorer who set out in 1845 to cross the last unnavigated section of the Northwest Passage. His two ships became icebound in the Canadian Arctic, and the entire expedition, 129 men plus Franklin himself, was lost. And it's just a few years ago that one of his ships, the Erebus, was discovered just north of the Canadian mainland. Franklin's a fascinating figure for you. Why is that?
A number of reasons. Again, I came to that story through the objects in the Maritime Museum in Greenwich in England. And again, the pathos of a comb, like this man's comb, and a boot buckle and all these things. And then the more I wondered again why Americans didn't know the story. Many Americans didn't know the story of Franklin. And he didn't succeed. It's sort of a loser story, and everyone likes the hero stories. And yet I think paying attention to what's lost is just as rewarding, I guess, in a way, to paying attention to what's achieved. And the story is it's a boy's own. And I really wanted to, when, the news of the Erebus was discovered, I thought, okay, well, this is enough of a news story to see if I could get the Times Magazine to send me and really go into both the Inuit side of the story and the Parks Canada side of the discovery. My history is in competitive sport, where the winning and losing is really high stakes. And the relationship to winning and losing has to be healthy. It has to be sort of understood that you're not going to win every time and you're not going to lose every time. And you just sort of persevere and figure out yourself through brutal rankings sometimes. And so loser stories have never really meant loser stories to me. They've meant gray stories. And so Franklin and these 129 men and these 3 graves on Beechey Island and sort of what happened and the John Geiger and Owen Beatty book about exhuming the graves. I mean, and again, the perfectly preserved corpse, like all of these things were just so delightful to me. These details of, one of the sailors who died, one of the first sailors who died and was buried on Beechey Island was because of the permafrost. Body is perfectly preserved, and he had like a polka dot handkerchief tied around his jaw.
To keep his mouth closed after he died.
To keep his mouth closed. Just these little details of bringing history to life. So anyway, to answer your question, the Franklin story just had so much converging in terms of objects, losers, loneliness, Canada, also at the time sort of do I stay or do I go-ness in my personal life, and do you stay on the ship or do you leave? Do you take the risk of walking 600 miles to a Hudson's Bay post, or do you, do your best and hope that some Inuit will come by with some seal meat? Like just these interesting decisions, and I fell in love with the Arctic on that trip in a big way. So that was also just such a gift to be able to go.
And you made replicas of some of the artifacts by painting them. You say by occluding the value of these pieces, you're trying to see the men in their lives. How does that work?
Well, I guess the story, or my attention to the story, started by looking at these screenshots of 300 artifacts that are kept in Greenwich. And you don't have access to them. You have to get sort of a special pass and go to some warehouse. And the curator had retired, and I couldn't get them. So all I had were these images on their website. And so I printed them out, and I just started looking at them and painting them. I just wanted to sort of do little studies of them. That's, again, part of my practice, is to draw and very physically and quickly get something down and study it. So I did these studies of these pieces, and then I started to think about snow blindness and abstracting them so they weren't realistic. I'm not a realist painter by any means, and so I sort of worked on really pale paper and worked in really pale paint, almost trying to find physical, visual compassion for what snow blindness must have felt like, because among the artifacts were these sort of hastily jury-rigged snow goggles that the men would use, just sort of little blue lens glasses or slits in bone. Inuit snow goggles are really interesting. And then this became a sort of metaphor for me that when you do occlude your vision and when you do sort of rely on what you see less, you can feel more, you can sometimes understand more. And this, again, sort of goes into my distrust of photography and obsession with photography. So what are we giving up when we trust photography so much these days everywhere? So yeah, I was trying to go, okay, there are all these facts about these men and their tragic story and the cannibalism and the scurvy and all this, but what was it like to be behind their eyeballs? What was it like to sort of hold these objects? And so it was just an attempt to study and to try to get a sense of who these people were.
But your own way of getting closer to it is through painting.
Through painting, through thinking, through study, just through looking. I mean, that comes from my background is life drawing, where you look at somebody, you look at something, and you imagine, because you can't run your hands over it, you have to feel it in a different way, and then that's translated to the page. And so when I look at something, I try to understand it in space, but also understand it emotionally, I suppose. And drawing is my first sort of training in that, but I try to do it when I write, too. But yeah, painting or drawing it is the first sort of step toward that kind of, I want to say, compassion or empathy or something.
Leanne Shapton, you developed a story, a novel, a very unusual one, out of objects and images. 10 years ago, you published a book titled Important Artifacts and Personal Property from the collection of Lenore Doolin and Harold Morris, including books, street fashion, and jewelry, in the form of an auction catalog. It follows the 4-year relationship between two invented characters, Lenore and Hal, through photos, personal goods for sale, and the captions that accompany each lot. What was the idea behind the book? What made you want to tell a story in this way?
I think it was my interest in sentimental value and why we keep things and what they mean and how we live with them. I had just moved in around the time I was thinking of this story. I'd moved in with my then boyfriend and future husband and didn't quite know what to do with these boxes of old love letters and things like that. At the same time, I saw a single-owner auction of Truman Capote's personal belongings that went up for sale at an auction house here in New York. And also at the same time, I got a catalog from another exhibition on the letters between Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. And so there was this, I don't know, I guess convergence of this idea of things and relationships all happening at the same time. And when I read and looked at the auction catalog from the Capote sale and saw sort of the state some of the things were in and the, one would say, lack of value, you know, a weird brick bunny, a stained army surplus sweater, these things, I thought, oh, this is so good. This is such a good way to tell a story of someone's life. Again, it was this portrait of Capote in his later years, but there was also, you know, the tuxedo he wore at the black and white ball and early drafts of books. And so it was a lifetime, but it was also sort of the end of his life. And I guess that was what gave me the idea to try to tell the story this way.
And the auction catalog follows the style of the major auction houses. It's crisp, it's cool, it's detached. How did that serve the story that you wanted to tell?
I think it did because that voice, that style, the Sotheby's voice, the Christie's voice, the Bonham's voice, we understand, and it gives the reader room to bring their own experience to it. And so it's interesting. I kind of liken it to a photocopy of a style of voice. Like sometimes, I use a lot of photographs in my work, but I copy voice in my work in this sort of ventriloquism. And so I wanted that style to be as neutral as possible, the way that objects at auction are photographed against those seamlesses. So again, there's nothing inflecting it from an author, me, so to speak, other than that frame. And so a reader can then bring their own kind of relation to those objects. And yeah, so my use of the neutral and the, I want to say vernacular or commonplace or shared reading of both language and images is really, I love playing with that stuff. And so I knew that in the form of an auction catalog, I had something that everyone understood at a glance and also verbally and orally heard at a glance, so to speak.
We surmise in this auction catalog that since their possessions are up for sale, that their relationship is over. Is it only in postmortem that we can try to analyze what happened? I mean, were you ever tempted to make the relationship work?
No. Never. I mean, I think that too was part of my research. I just read and read and read love stories, and they are finite. And they, sometimes they're finite and then they come back, and then sometimes they take on, I mean, I find love to be this really interesting topic, but all of my favorite love stories are the ones that sort of don't work and that don't line up. I mean, tragedies, La Bohème, there's just, we sort of know the end before we still were attracted to the idea of what played out in those 4 years, those 10 years, those 2 months, these intense kind of relationships that sort of make you who you are because you find out so much about yourself through another person. And I always say this, relationships sort of sharpen your edges and carve you. And so, no, I never really wanted to continue their story. And also, relationships are stories. Like it's fiction. Like, nobody really knows the truth about what goes on.
We've talked a bit about the environment that you grew up in. This is in Mississauga, a suburb of Toronto. And you describe your father as a libertarian with his own creative ideas on child rearing. Was that a good thing? Not
always, no. Not always. How to discipline or raise children is a question that every parent faces. And, yeah, not all of his methods were fantastic, but they did shape who I was. That love relationship shaped who I was. I mean, he is so remorseful about some of the experiments that he tried. And I do write about this in Swimming Studies, how my probably lifelong fear of the dark, but also interest in ghosts and in fear, was inspired by him saying, I don't believe in corporal punishment or spanking, but maybe if we put you in the basement in the dark as punishment for a period of time. That lasted for a while. My brother and I both survived it.
Is your brother also afraid of the dark?
Well, see, he told me that once my dad went back upstairs, he turned a light on down there, and he's like, "Didn't you do that?" But I just assumed that, and I was like, "No, I was being like, I was good. I was being like, I had to," and I would just screw my eyes shut and sit in this chair in the dark because I was so afraid of what. And he was much more clever than I was. And then when he heard my dad come back downstairs, he turned the light off again. I mean, he's a survivor. Anyway, we had a laugh about it, but I mean, because this is on air, I do have to explain that my father is so ashamed of that experiment, and I've forgiven him.
Well, and of course now he can claim to be an inspiration for some of your best books.
I'm sure, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is something that I want to talk about maybe in my next book is the idea of it's gonna sound funny, and I'm shaping it now, but the idea of libertarianism and Filipinoism, a sort of a very caring kind of society and ideology in a lot of ways, and libertarianism being almost diametrically opposite to that. And that was the environment I grew up in. My mom and my dad kind of showing me these two sides.
Because your mother is from the Philippines. She immigrated when she was 22.
22, yeah.
Did she come to Canada with her family?
She didn't. She was the first of her family. She had 5 siblings. She was the first of her family to come. Brampton was a booming flower industry, and they were hiring a lot of secretaries. And she came over with a friend. And then she met my father, and the two of them sponsored all the other family to come over in the 70s. And so now all of the immediate family are over here.
And did she maintain strong ties to her community?
In the Philippines, yes. I mean, I think Filipinos definitely maintain strong ties almost always. Also, there's such a huge Filipino community in Canada. And with all of her brother and all of her sisters here. Actually, one sister went to New Zealand. But our social life was her family. I found, because I still keep everything, I found a diary I wrote when I was probably in 6th grade, maybe around 10, and it just said, going to another party this weekend, and the party is just going to another Filipino's house and eating like pork and rice and just, all this stuff. But we called them parties. And it sounds so sort of festive, but it's just gathering bodies, food, kainan, you have to eat. And so that was a really big part of growing up. And, of course, my grandmother looked after us a lot, and the aunts were always around. It was very, very, very warm.
So what kind of appreciation, you alluded to it a little bit, but what kind of appreciation were you raised with for your Filipino heritage?
It's funny. I feel like I wish I'd had more. My brother and I were half. And so when we went to the Filipino Heritage Program to learn Tagalog, we were kind of cast out. So we didn't go on Saturdays to learn Tagalog, and that sort of ended pretty quickly. Most of the other kids in the Filipino Heritage Program knew Tagalog already. They just seemed so cool, too. They're so intimidatingly cool. And I think I didn't feel part of that heritage so much when I was growing up, even though we socialized a lot with that. And also because this is reflected in books and media, the white side was presented to me more. And so I did probably take more cues from that. And I'm now, as a mother, I really want my daughter to both feel more Canadian and get in touch with the Filipino side as well, because I see how enriching it can be and how you can, again, just have compassion for so many more cultures if you understand the tiny little brown fraction you are. So, yeah, I feel like that's actually not a huge part of my life now, and I wish I had more of it.
Leanne Shapton, as you recall in your memoir, Swimming Studies, competitive swimming was the focus of your youth. I mean, hours of training, early morning wake-ups for practice, and again after school, traveling for meets. How did swimming define you? I still dream. I still have dreams about lap swimming and races. Are they good dreams or bad dreams?
It's anxiety dreams.
Bad dreams.
Yeah, I think so. But I think it defined my practice. It defined my training. It defined my sense of what I need to do to get things done. It defined a certain self-reliance, a certain protection and pride in what I do. And in swimming studies, I try to explain that, I didn't go to university. I didn't go to art college. And so my training is the repetition that I found in the pool. If you do something 100 times, you'll get close to the way you want to do it. If you draw something 100 times, if you write and rewrite, you'll get closer. And so I credit the training I had as a swimmer to my education, basically, how to get things done.
Because you did go to university, but you dropped out, and you did go to art college, and you dropped out.
But I dropped out. Yeah, 4 months in one place, 1 year in another.
Right,
place.
1 year at McGill, 4 months at Pratt.
Yeah, and I do have to say, I joined the varsity team in 1991 to train for the 92 trials, and to join the varsity team, I had to take part-time courses at the University of Toronto, and I took a fantastic course in the short story, and that was formative. It was absolutely formative. And so even what little formal education I had, it really did make an impact. And at McGill, Canadian literature and history of photography, those two courses just set the course of my life. So it was, really meant a lot to me, those tiny, tiny forays into formal education. But yeah, I dropped out.
And you also, when you were around 16 or 17, you gave up swimming in 1989 and later took it up again. Mm-hmm. Was it the demands of the sport or the sacrifice, or what made you so ambivalent?
I wasn't ambivalent. It was a move to the country that made me quit. And the ambivalence, I suppose you could say ambivalent, because I didn't want to live with another family.
Oh, so your parents moved to the country, taking you away from where your practice pools and everything
exactly.
was? Okay.
Exactly. It was, even though I was doing well and sort of ranked 8th, it wasn't a motivating factor to stay in Mississauga. My parents wanted to move to the country. That was the decision. And I really wasn't, how do I say this? I was a good swimmer. I loved training, I loved practice, but I didn't have super close friends as other swimmers. All my friends were from school, and so the idea of living with strangers was just too much as a 14, 15-year-old to get my head around. And I was already interested in arts, and there's a Peel School of the Arts accepted me in the visual arts program, so I just thought, okay, that's going to be my next thing. But I did miss swimming terribly.
And then you went back to it?
Mm-hmm. Then I went back to it because of that. The agency of quitting I felt was taken away from me when I was 15, and I wanted to quit again and see how it felt when I made the decision. So I finished high school a year early, took a year off, trained at U of T where I did that part-time class in the short story collection, and lived in a basement apartment in East Toronto and trained, sort of got back to close to what my times were, 3 or 4 years earlier, and then quit after the 92 trials. So it was a closure, I guess, as they say.
Hi, I'm Jamie Poisson, host of Front Burner, the CBC's daily news podcast.
This is the first pandemic caused by a coronavirus.
The involvement that I'd had should have had me remove myself from those discussions.
Every weekday morning, we bring you one important story in depth and detail, and we do it in about 20 minutes. Of course, we cover a lot of Canadian news, but there's a whole world out there, and we bring you those stories too. You can subscribe to Front Burner wherever you get your podcasts, or get Front Burner on the CBC Listen app.
It wasn't until your late 20s that you were diagnosed with clinical depression, although you've said you were always somewhat moody and anxious. But how did it feel to get that diagnosis?
It was scary. It was scary. going on antidepressants was scary. I just thought, gosh, this is the rest of my life. It felt like some kind of adulthood. Diagnosis was sort of very serious to me. And I'm in my head a lot because of painting and writing and looking. So I was scared, but also it was, I suppose, a relief the way any diagnosis can be. And I had a good therapist who recommended cognitive behavioral therapy. And having done that once and understanding how that works, but also how talk therapy works, I'm really interested in psychotherapy, mental health, all of these things. And it's, it's something I kind of love to read and talk about now. But yeah, back then I just thought, oh my God, something's wrong with my head. It's just going to get worse.
But it hasn't.
I mean, who knows?
No, but you talked about how, and this I found so interesting, that cognitive behavioral therapy made so sense to you through your experience in swimming.
Yeah, it did. Because I just, this therapist, Dr. Zaretsky, just handed me these worksheets. And I just looked at them and I was like, how many do I do before I feel better? And he's like, 100. I was like, okay, check. Like, I can do that. So, you know what I mean? Like the idea of practice and the idea of training your mind. And, it's funny because I haven't done CBT since, 2003, 2004, but understanding that the mind can be a muscle like that and outlook can be changed and work. Therapy is work and it is concentration. And the training I had in swimming did help get my head around it, so to speak.
So 100 times was for you was like doing 100 laps. And
Yeah. I could, buckle down. I could go, okay, let's see if that works. Let's see if that will make me stronger. So yeah, again, that training comes in handy.
When you say you haven't been in cognitive behavioral therapy since 2003, is there a part of you that your body knows those exercises, or your head knows how to do that, to re-engage?
I rely more on talk therapy now. And in conversation, sort of knowing when I'm engaged and not engaged. Look, I might go back to it again, but sort of understanding the idea of engagement, the idea of rumination, the idea that your mind can really get stuck and that can really affect your life made a lot of sense then. I think conversation and talking is healthy. And it really does help with my depression anyway.
Leanne Shapton, in your latest work, Guest Book, there's a section titled At the Foot of the Bed. Empty beds seem to have a particular power for you. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this story collects a lot of interesting themes for me. Part of my method in research is asking people their own stories. So, for instance, with Was She Pretty?, I asked people if they were jealous. And a lot of people said, oh, no, I'm not jealous. And a lot of people said, oh, my God, yeah, I'm jealous. Let me tell you this time when, I body checked a woman in the, frozen food section or, this, and then people have stories about jealousy.
Because Was She Pretty was about people's exes.
Yes, and sexual jealousy. And for Guest Book, my question was, do you believe in ghosts? Do you have a ghost story? And as opposed to jealousy, more people had ghost stories than jealousy stories. And I think it's less a taboo to have a ghost story than to admit that you're jealous. And a lot of stories said, yeah, one day or one night I woke up and I had sleep paralysis and there was something at the foot of the bed. And this idea of the foot of the bed came up again and again. There was a woman at the foot of the bed. There was something at the foot of the bed. There was a couple at the foot of the bed. And again, you're in this, half sleep state when you've just woke up and you're in bed. But I just kept on hearing these stories again and again. And because I'm interested in photography so much, I'm always looking at popular photography, vernacular photography, magazine advertising photography. And I began to notice, in shelter magazines and in decor publications and books on houses that bedrooms are always photographed from the foot of the bed. And so I thought, okay, who's there? Are we there? Like, why are we looking at this empty bed? And who is in this real estate where the camera is? And what are we looking at? And when we look at a bed like this, and it's supposed to be aspirational and dreamy and informational, but the camera's always in the same place, what does this mean? And so I collected all these stories about something being at the foot of the bed, and then all these images of the camera positioned at the foot of the bed, and put them together. And I really, really wanted to both comment on that we are the ones at the foot of the bed. We've always been there, apprehending the bed. And I kind of like, again, to play with the idea of what we are spoon-fed in terms of images over and over again, just through advertising, through media, and really look at what we collectively look at in passing and flipping through a Restoration Hardware catalog, and be thoughtful about where the camera is.
Your latest work, titled Guest Book Ghost Stories, I mean, it brings together a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of personal possessions, their emotional power, the stories they inspire. It's a collection of short stories, hearsay accounts, photographs, paintings, fragments of text, and it all circles around the idea of hauntings, I mean, in one way or another. Now, you said that you've never seen a ghost, but you can feel them. Mm-hmm. How does that work?
Just jumpy. I've never seen a ghost. I'm terrified too. That was one of the things I used to say in the chair in the basement, just please let me not see a ghost. Please let me not see a ghost. So I obviously believed in them on some level and was scared of them. And I've always believed in them. I do get senses of places. Again, it's that thing of walking through a person's house and getting a portrait of them, looking at their shoe size and what curtains they have. When I walk into a space, sometimes it's neutral. Sometimes it feels off. Sometimes it feels sad. I can feel those things. And I don't know that I can always feel ghosts, but I can. And I think we're all capable of this. We have senses. We have our sense of smell, our sense of safety as animal are always sort of worked on. You know, and there's places that my imagination can run away with. There's a house that I once lived in where a drowning happened on the grounds, and so that really did affect how I felt in the house. It was a little dark, yeah.
Well, maybe even especially, I mean, you're being a swimmer and somebody drowns.
Yeah. And also just all those incredible stories, like the history of stories, ghost stories about drownings, and folklore about drownings. I get really affected by those.
But you've had an appetite for ghost stories all your life.
All my life, and not just typical ghosts. Like there's, but like the dead, like
James Joyce's.
Or Christmas Carol. Like just these. I love them. Hamlet. Not just typical like spooky. Ghost stories.
And do you understand why?
I think it just might be this relationship I have to them that I believe what I don't see. I guess something like that. I think the drama in them, ghost stories, are one of these things that we've always had. And usually they're cautionary tales, so children don't die. Inuit ghost stories are always like, just don't get lost in the dark in the ice. That's a very crucial form of storytelling. But I'm interested in how culturally writers write about, parents talk about the ghosts we need given any time. So I'm interested in the evolution of this form. And now that we live in such an image-driven and inflected world, I really wanted to understand what our ghost stories might look like. Even this, how we feel so much emotion looking at an Instagram feed, looking at images that were sent over our phones and computers. We all take pictures with so much velocity now. This has got to have some impact on what we fear, believe. And so I'm really interested in the future of the ghost story.
Could you read from Guest Book?
Sure. Okay. I was home visiting my parents for the weekend with my daughter, Alice. My parents were happy to see her and gave Alice toys to play with that I'd never seen before, old dolls and plastic baskets. When I asked where they had come from, my father said they'd found them in the free area at the dump. After lunch one day, as Alice played in the living room, my mother told me a ghost story. My mother's father had died in a mining accident when she was 8. Her aunt, Sinfarosa, his sister, told her the story. Sinfarosa said that on the night my mother's father died, he came to her and slept beside her. My mother said this in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, with a firm look in her eyes. She told me that as children, her father and his sisters had all slept together on the floor under the blankets. Sinfarosa had told my mother that she knew it was her brother because of his feet. I know his feet, she had said. He had come back to her, to them, as children. I asked my mother if she had ever seen his ghost. She said she had not, but once, she said, she was visited by the ghost of a teacher. He was her favorite teacher, and he had a smell of soap. She was a favorite of his, too, and at school he paid special attention to her. The night he died, she said, she woke up and her bedroom smelled strongly of him, of his soap. She knew he was saying goodbye, she said, as she picked at the tablecloth.
Leanne Shapton, reading from her latest book, Guest Book, Ghost Stories. What can you tell me about this story? I mean, is it your mother speaking? Does she believe in these ghosts?
Yeah, she does, and this was another kind of lovely part of making this book, was talking to my mother about Filipino ghosts and collecting these stories that had been passed down to her. And I love the idea of knowing that something was there because this version of this woman, Sinfarosa, had recognized her brother's feet. I thought it was so sweet that, it wasn't a face or a figure or not necessarily even a smell, although that's why I'm sort of telling my mom's ghost story too, that it's a smell or it's the shape of feet. But, his feet as a child, the memory of sort of maybe sleeping head to toe. I'm not quite sure what the configuration was, but just that trying to get at that sensation and that memory of children sleeping together in a bed or on the floor. I don't know. I was so touched by that. And I loved that was the ghost story. So this came about by, again, my 8 or 7 years of just asking people to tell me their ghost stories. What are they? What were they? And then trying to kind of make sense of why people carried them, how people saw them, where people put them in their lives now.
So had you heard these before?
I hadn't heard the foot one. And
you hadn't heard Sinfarosa?
No, I hadn't until probably about 2 years ago. And I think I'd heard as a teenager or something, I'd heard the soap one. I had heard that one.
About your mother's teacher?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are 3 dreams in the book, all told in images, briefly captioned. I mean, Dream 1 features moody, darkly lit pictures of an old house from different views.
Mm-hmm.
Dream 2, there are photos of another old house from different decades, possibly a lifeless baby in a crib. There's a baby in a crib. Mm-hmm. The third is most mysterious and equally chilling. It's captioned The Cellar, the ice house where bodies were kept until the ground thawed, and the table plan. I mean, you can get a frisson just, with these images and these texts, but are there actual stories behind the dreams?
They're not, but I'm glad you did 2 things. You said, a possibly lifeless baby and the frisson. And that was what I was trying to kind of achieve, was the sort of hint of a story by inflection. I'm really interested in those parts of books where the photo signatures of books, people call them sort of the plate section, or where you're told the story traditionally, in blocks of text on either side of these photo signatures, and then you get these pages of, the subject's grandfather or their children, school pictures, whatever, and then there's these captions that one assumes the reader knows about, and often are written in this oblique, understanding language. But when you read them without the rest of the story, your mind fills in the blanks. And these 3 dreams were a way to sort of recreate that experience when, say, you're in a bookstore and you go to the biography section, you pick up a biography of somebody, then you flip to those middle pages where you don't know the story, but you see the pictures and are reading these captions and pictures, and you're getting a sense of the story, but not the whole story. And that's where a lot of the idea for the book came from, my love of getting almost those trailers, those picture trailers for the book in those photo parts. And so this is my attempt to try to have the reader go, oh, is it a lifeless baby? Oh, I get a creeped out feeling, because those captions are very neutral. Again, kind of talking back to the auction catalog. They're very, very neutral, but because of how I'm hoping the reader comes to this story in the book, and I'm hoping to kind of entertain that way and have the reader feel something.
A section of guest book that's equally cryptic is called Gymnopédie, but I understand that here there is a very personal resonance. What's it about?
Yeah, this was my grandmother died at the end of the summer last year, and for a while she was living with my parents in their house and living with my aunt in her house in Etobicoke, and my mother was keeping notes on kind of her behavior and telling me stories of her behavior. And I've always been interested in floor plans and how we read rooms and houses through plan views, and sometimes elevations, but plan views in particular. And I thought about how, my mom had these stories of how my grandmother, who's so tiny and frail, would push a big dresser up against the door or push furniture around the room and rearrange stuff all the time. And I wondered how she saw her layout and what floor plan she was working to. They had to sort of put a barricade in the hallway made of like weird plastic fencing so that she wouldn't in the night kind of walk upstairs, because she kept on walking upstairs and they were really worried she'd fall in the dark. And so her, I guess, topology in her mind, I was curious about what she was thinking, what walls weren't there and were there in her head. And so with floor plans, I just sort of photoshopped rooms on top of rooms and rooms that didn't exist or go anywhere, a little bit inspired by that Winchester House story, California Winchester House, where this woman built rooms that made no sense and went nowhere to sort of confuse the spirits. But the text in Gymnopédie is directly from my mom's notes of what my grandmother was doing, barricading bedroom from door inside, refusing to bathe, rearranging things, asking where everyone is, including her deceased siblings. And again, these were little ghost stories she was playing out in her head. And, dementia is an incredibly commonplace thing. I mean, it happens, and so many families deal with someone going through something, seeing things differently every day and every night. So I just wanted to make a little story around that.
And the title, Gymnopédie, I mean, to me, it brings to mind the French composer Erik Satie's famous piano compositions.
Yeah, it was the idea of composition. It was the idea of I wanted a musical title because I wondered, again, what my grandmother was composing in her head in terms of where things were. And I it's an unusual word, and it sort of has to do with movement and dance and composition. And so that's sort of where it came from. I like the idea of the body in space and composition. Yeah, you nailed it.
And then there's Billy Byron, a tennis player with some issues, we could say, and his life is captured in snapshots, artwork, and text. What's his story?
I really like this story. I'm glad we're talking about it. This actually predates my interest in Franklin, because I was really interested in John Geiger, who's the CEO of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, wrote a book about the sensed presence. And it's a presence that, if I can try to describe it quickly, it's a presence that often in moments of trauma, explorers will experience, or survivors of accidents will experience a sensed presence, another person there, often to the right and behind them. And so he wrote a book about explorers' accounts, like Shackleton, Earhart, Lindbergh, accounts of these presences. And I've always loved the D.H. Lawrence story, again, back to my love of ghost stories, The Rocking Horse Winner, and how that, in some ways, is about a conjured sense presence that isn't benevolent and that leads this boy and his sense of absence, of, money being absent in the family home, to, darker areas. And it's an incredible, wonderful story. And I've always wanted to also write a ghost story about an athlete, because, again, this is ghosts and sports. You don't really see together that much. So I asked John Geiger a little bit more about the conditions under which the sensed presence was sensed. And he said, well, conditions of trauma, and it's also linked to the imaginary friend. It's a coping mechanism, scientifically. So I said, okay, well, then I thought if I wanted an athlete to experience that, I obviously have to drive them to the brink of exhaustion, injury. possibly even coma or death. And that again linked back to the Rocking Horse Winner, the boy in the Rocking Horse Winner driving himself to exhaustion to get the winners of the horse races. And so it again brought together my love of popular sport and my love of how a ghost story and how desire can conjure good and evil at the same time. Because
Billy Byron has an imaginary friend as a child, and then when he's pushed to the limit as a tennis player, he communicates with him.
To win, he has to push himself to get Walter to help him and communicate with him and tell him where the ball's going. And to win, he has to push himself to near collapse. And Walter's not good for him. Although, that the desire to win is and to have and to be a champion is such a understandable thing in the world of sports and victory.
I love the idea that Walter would tell him where the balls are going to be.
Well, they always say, a good player knows where the ball's going. I was trying to, again, use how athletes talk about their own talent sometimes.
Your own stories of how the different parts of Guestbook came into being are kind of like ghost stories themselves. I mean, existing within the pages of your book.
This is a collection of me trying to talk about loss, trying to talk about living with something that's alive but not there anymore. I mean, often I talk about how it is a book about divorce more than anything, about something that was there that's not, that does still have a place, something that died, and, living with that death on a daily basis. It's intensely personal. At the same time, I am trying to be very playful with this modern idea of visual literacy and how photographs affect us emotionally. So it's a mixed bag. Yeah. Yeah.
Like all your work.
Yeah.
It's great to have the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure. I love your show. I love your work.
Leanne Shapton in New York. Her latest work, guest book, Ghost Stories, as well as her earlier memoir, Swimming Studies, are available from Penguin Random House. Most of her earlier titles are published by Drawn and Quarterly. Her novel as auction catalog, Important Artifacts and Personal Property from the collection of Lenore Doolin and Harold Morris, is available in paperback from Raincoast Books. Writers and Company is produced by Sandra Rabinovich. Katie Swales is associate producer. We always like to hear from you. Our email address is writersandco@cbc.ca. The executive producer is Tara Mora. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Next week, to wrap up our special programming in celebration of Writers and Company's 30th anniversary season, a look back at the show's 25th anniversary with Alexander Hamon, Carol Phillips, and Zadie Smith on stage at the Toronto International Festival of Authors. That's next week. I hope you join me.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.